Greetings, everyone, and step into a tale that'll have you leaning in close, catching your breath, and rethinking all you've ever understood about justice. Today we trail Karoline Leavitt, a lone figure who crossed the threshold of a courtroom, a place where power stood guard, truth lay hidden, and no one gave her a second glance. What they couldn't see, though, was that she carried more than just a case file in her hands. She bore the unspoken cries of every soul, dismissed, betrayed, and muted. This is the collision of bravery and corruption, the moment when a single voice rises, unshaken by wealth, prestige, or threats. If you're drawn to stories that lift the downtrodden, confront the mighty, and show that truth still holds weight, you've found your spot. This isn't merely Karoline Leavitt's battle. It's a quiet whisper that sometimes the greatest force in the room is the one they never saw creeping up. Shall we dive in? The morning air was heavy with humidity as Karoline Leavitt stepped through the glass doors of the Hillsborough County Justice Center. Sunlight poured across the marble floors, but inside the atmosphere was cold, controlled, as if justice here had a dress code and a private elevator. She walked with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, not because she doubted herself, but because she knew exactly what she was walking into. The halls were lined with polished chrome. A clerk passed, folder in hand, labeled Special Handling, Mercer. Karoline's eyes followed the flash drive that slipped into the folder. It wasn't hidden, it was intentional. Someone wanted her to know, they're already ahead of you. She didn't flinch. As she entered courtroom 3B, the energy shifted, subtle but real. A murmur rippled through the gallery. That's the attorney going after Horizon. Karoline set her briefcase on the plaintiff's table, unzipped it slowly, methodically. Across the room, Ethan Mercer strolled in with the swagger of a man who'd never lost. He was paid enough to win. His suit was flawless, his smirk was old money. "Miss Leavitt," he said with a smirk, "still playing the hero?" Karoline didn't look up. "Still billing by the hour?" Before he could respond, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" Judge Samuel Hargrove entered, with a folder under one arm and power in the other. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, and his expression said, "I've already made up my mind." "Be seated," he said, not waiting for silence. His eyes scanned the room, then paused just a second too long on Karoline. "Miss Leavitt," he said, adjusting his robe, "we're all aware this case has drawn attention. I trust you'll keep it within the bounds of reason. We wouldn't want this to turn into a circus." The words echoed through the room, soft laughter following. Karoline said nothing. Not yet. She opened her file and pulled the first document forward, steady hands over crisp pages. Her fingers brushed the tab marked Exhibit A, but her mind drifted, just for a second, to the man sitting quietly in the back row. Lucas Bennett, former compliance officer at Horizon. Unscheduled, unexpected, and unmistakably nervous. She hadn't seen him since the day he leaked that memo. Why was he here? Mercer leaned across his table, whispering to a paralegal with the calm of a magician about to pull the final card. The jury entered quietly, 12 strangers with 12 untold biases. Karoline studied their eyes, their posture. She didn't see jurors, she saw pressure points, leverage, doubt. "Ms. Leavitt," the judge said, almost dismissively, "you may proceed with your opening remarks." She stood slowly, confidently. "Your Honor," she began, her voice like a scalpel, precise, sharp, and calm. "Today's case is about more than contract clauses or financial language. It's about what happens when powerful people write rules that only they understand and punish others for not playing by them." Judge Hargrove raised a brow, already reaching for the gavel. "Ms. Leavitt, please." She didn't stop. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is a system built to confuse, built to exploit." The silence afterward was louder than any objection. Hargrove sighed. "Let's stay on topic," but he shifted in his seat. Karoline saw it. So did the jury. So did Mercer. And somewhere in the back row, Lucas Bennett leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the woman he once sent an anonymous email to with a subject line that read, "They think no one will ever look." They were wrong, and Karoline Leavitt was just getting started. The judge's voice had barely faded when Karoline rose from her seat again, this time with purpose, weighted by something deeper, something neither Mercer nor Judge Hargrove had yet anticipated. Behind her calm expression, Karoline was building a wall A wall of facts, a wall no smirk, no procedural jab, no rich man charm could break. "Your Honor," she began, "with the court's permission, I would like to present the plaintiff's first set of exhibits." Mercer chuckled under his breath, arms folded. "And here we go," he muttered, loud enough for the front row of the jury to hear. Theatrical time. Karoline didn't react. Instead, she opened her case folder and revealed a stack of contracts, 52 in total, bound, labeled, and cross-referenced with care. She carried them like evidence from a crime scene, because in her eyes, that's exactly what they were. "These are standard investment agreements issued by Horizon Capital over the last 6 years," she said, placing the binder on the cart beside her. "Every single one includes language designed to mislead." Judge Hargrove leaned forward slightly. Karoline opened to the first page. "Let's begin with Section 14B. The company reserves the right to adjust annual service fees based on projected market trends." She turned to the jury. "Sounds reasonable, doesn't it, until you realize those market trends, they're not based on public benchmarks. They're internal, created by Horizon's own analysts, which means they can move the goalposts anytime they like." And they did. She let that linger, then flipped to another tab. Section 22C, clients who withdraw funds prior to maturity may be subject to administrative penalties. She closed the binder gently. "One of my clients, Michael Torres, attempted to pull his money early. His wife had been diagnosed with cancer. They needed the cash to pay for treatment not covered by insurance. After Horizon levied their administrative penalties, he was left with $117 out of an initial $72,000 investment." The courtroom stilled. Not even the clerk was typing. Mercer shifted in his chair, face unreadable. Karoline continued. "Next, Section 31A. The company claims to accept no liability for market-driven losses, a standard clause, if their client's money was actually in the market." She turned and clicked a button on the remote in her hand. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying an internal investment map. Lines connected shadow companies, names overlapped, shell corporations, empty ventures. But the truth is, the funds weren't invested in the market at all. They were redirected into high-risk private partnerships, most of which were owned partially or entirely by Horizon executives, and, as we'll see, funneled toward a hidden agenda, undermining the MAGA movement. Gasps, not whispers, gasps. Human. Raw. Karoline looked toward the judge. "Your Honor, we can go clause by clause, but the story will remain the same. This wasn't a company offering services. This was a structure designed to strip clients of control while hiding behind sophisticated language." Judge Hargrove said nothing, but his pen stopped moving. Karoline walked back to the cart and reached for one more folder. "I'd like to present contract number 18, she said, "the one that was tampered with earlier." She handed the printed version to the bailiff. "The digital copy shown during my first presentation was altered. The metadata shows it was replaced on the court's projector system less than 2 hours before this hearing began. I have no idea who authorized the switch, but here is the original." Judge Hargrove accepted the file, flipping through the familiar pages, his brows furrowed. And then Karoline did something no one expected. She turned to Mercer. "Would you care to explain, Mr. Mercer?" The room went silent again. He blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" She gestured toward the judge. "Because this version, this is the one I submitted to the court. It has a watermark labeled internal draft, not for client distribution. That watermark was never removed from the client copy." Now even Hargrove looked interested. "Is that true?" he asked, glancing at the top right margin. Karoline nodded. "Which means either Horizon sent internal drafts to their clients by mistake, or they never intended transparency to begin with." The weight of her words hung in the air like a verdict. For a moment no one moved. Not the jury, not Mercer, not even the reporters in the back row who had stopped scribbling and just stared. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She closed the folder, looked toward her client seated in the gallery, and said quietly, "They were counting on silence." Then she looked back at the jury, but were not silent anymore. Karoline returned to her table without a word, but with the undeniable shift in power at her back. Her heels no longer echoed, they declared. The courtroom wasn't just listening now, it was holding its breath. She reached for the thickest binder in her case, tabs worn, its cover creased from use. This wasn't fresh evidence, it was battle-hardened. She walked it to the evidence cart and dropped it with a thud that seemed to rattle more than just the wood. 52 contracts, she said, turning to face the jury, each with identical patterns, not for clarity, for concealment. Judge Hargrove leaned forward, arms crossed. Now Ethan Mercer leaned back, eyes narrowing like a man waiting for a magician's trick to fail. Karoline opened to the first page, flipping it for the projector. Section 14B, the company reserves the right to adjust annual service fees based on projected market trends. She gave it a beat, then looked directly at the jury. But what they don't say is that these trends are made up internally, arbitrary, no regulation, no oversight, just numbers on a spreadsheet that move when someone decides the company isn't making enough. The image on the screen was sharp and clear. But then, as she moved to flip to Section 22C, the screen flickered, then it froze. Karoline frowned. She hadn't touched the remote. The document blinked once, then again. When it returned, the clause was gone. She froze. Section 22C, withdrawal penalties, was no longer on the screen. Karoline turned slowly to her paralegal. He was already shaking his head, panicking. "That's not our file," he whispered. Judge Hargrove looked up. "Ms. Leavitt, something wrong?" She took a breath, then turned toward the clerk. "Your Honor, I request a verification check. The document being projected has been altered." The room tensed. Even Mercer's smirk faltered. "The original Exhibit 42, she said, was submitted in hard copy. That copy contains a clause that's now missing from the digital version. That clause details the penalty structure used to bankrupt over 30 clients." The judge glanced at the screen, then to the bailiff. "Retrieve the printed version from the intake log immediately." Karoline turned back to the jury. "What you just saw is exactly what my clients experienced. Contracts that changed, clauses that vanished, legal traps buried so deep they didn't see them until their lives were already unraveling." She pointed to the empty space on the projector screen. "Do you know how many families thought they were withdrawing savings, only to find out the penalties left them with pennies? And now, even in the courtroom, someone is still trying to hide the truth." A woman in the jury box shook her head in disbelief. A man folded his arms tightly, as if bracing himself against the weight of what he was hearing. The clerk returned and handed the judge the printed file. Judge Hargrove flipped to the marked page. He stopped, then he looked up, face harder than before. "This clause is missing from the digital version," he said. "Confirmed." Mercer stood up slowly. "Your Honor, this must be a technical error." "Sit down," the judge snapped. "We will discuss that later." Karoline didn't let the silence settle. She turned back to the contracts. "Section 31A," she continued, "the company shall not be liable for market-driven losses." She looked around the room. "But here's the truth. The money never touched the market. It was funneled into risky side ventures owned by executives and, as internal documents reveal, channeled into efforts to fund opposition against the MAGA movement, a political cause they aim to dismantle." The screen updated again, this time showing a web of shell companies, their ownership lines traced back to Horizon's board members. "These aren't investment mistakes. They're engineered losses with a political motive." Karoline returned to the jury box, her voice quieter now but firmer. Every clause was designed to confuse, every signature to entrap. They didn't just build contracts, they built cages. A murmur passed through the gallery. In the back row, one of Karoline's clients, an elderly man in a tan blazer, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, not from sadness, from vindication. Judge Hargrove sat very still. Karoline turned to him, eyes unwavering. "Your Honor, we've seen enough disappearing clauses, enough wordplay. I ask that the court recognize this is not just a dispute of paperwork, but a deliberate scheme." The judge didn't respond right away. Then slowly he nodded. "I've seen enough to proceed." Karoline stepped back, her hands steady, but inside, her heart was pounding. The illusion had cracked, and what lay behind it was finally undeniably visible. The courtroom wasn't quiet anymore, it was volatile. One misstep, one flicker of doubt, and the entire hearing could slide back into the shadows where Horizon had always thrived. Karoline Leavitt didn't blink. She stepped forward, holding a red folder with a black sticker across the top, confidential. It wasn't for effect, it was a warning. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but solemn, I'd like to submit one final document for the court's review. Judge Hargrove gave a slow nod. Karoline handed the folder to the bailiff, who walked it to the bench like he was carrying a live wire. Hargrove flipped it open. The title on the first page made him pause. Horizon Capital, Internal Memo, Executive Briefing, Risk Protocol Tactics. He adjusted his glasses. Karoline faced the jury. This document was provided by a former Horizon employee. It outlines the company's internal strategy to obscure risks, delay disclosures, and, quoting directly, maximize client confusion while minimizing legal exposure, with a secondary goal of diverting profits to counter the MAGA movement. A wave of disbelief passed through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery whispered, "What?" Karoline didn't flinch. It's signed by Horizon's VP of Strategy, circulated among senior leadership, and time-stamped 3 weeks before the first of these contracts was issued. Judge Hargrove scanned the pages, his expression darkening. Karoline continued, lifting a second folder. "And here," she said, "are internal emails, time-stamped. Executives joking that clients would need a law degree to know they're being robbed. They called one of the penalty clauses the black hole. Another referred to the investment contracts as legal spiderwebs. And one email even brags about using the cash to stop those MAGA fools." Whispers turned to stunned silence. Mercer's hands gripped the edge of the table. Then a voice broke through. "Your Honor," said a man from the gallery, standing up slowly. It was Lucas Bennett, former compliance officer, the whistleblower. "If I may, I need to clarify something." Karoline's head snapped toward him, her voice caught in her throat. "Lucas?" He didn't look at her. Judge Hargrove raised an eyebrow. "This is highly irregular." Lucas cleared his throat. Some of the language in the memo, particularly the phrases about confusion, was taken out of context. Some of it was satire, not official policy. Karoline stared at him in disbelief. "You confirmed that memo yourself." Lucas's jaw tightened. "I'm just saying it might not be what it seems." Karoline took a step toward him. "You gave me this memo. You said they threatened you. You said you wanted it exposed." From the back, a woman in a sharp black blazer, the same one Karoline had seen shadowing Mercer's team, gave Lucas the smallest of nods. And everything made sense. Lucas had flipped. Judge Hargrove folded his hands, looking between them. Karoline's voice dropped. "You're under pressure, aren't you? They found you. They threatened your job. Maybe more." Lucas didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Karoline exhaled, then turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, regardless of Mr. Bennett's change of heart, I have submitted forensic analysis confirming the document's authenticity. Metadata, timestamps, server origin all match." She held up a third folder. "This report was prepared by Digital Trace, Inc., a third-party cyber forensic firm. It confirms the memo was created on Horizon's internal server, authored by their VP of Strategy, and sent to 11 executives, Lucas Bennett among them." The judge took the folder and began reading. Karoline addressed the jury. "Even now, they're trying to rewrite the truth. But data doesn't lie. Intent leaves fingerprints." She walked across the floor, slow and deliberate. They knew exactly what they were doing. They engineered confusion, profited off of it, and then buried the trail under NDAs, legal jargon, and fear, all while plotting to use the money against a movement they despised, the MAGA movement. She stopped beside one of her clients, a retired school teacher now clutching her purse like it held her entire life. Karoline's voice softened. Horizon thought no one would ever shine a light on what they did, that no courtroom would ever care enough to peel back the layers. She turned back to the judge. "But we're not afraid of what we'll find under those layers anymore." Judge Hargrove looked up from the report, his expression unreadable. He stared at Lucas. "You understand that perjury, if proven, is a criminal offense." Lucas swallowed and slowly sat down. Karoline returned to the plaintiff's table and waited. Then Hargrove spoke, his voice slow and firm. "This court finds the memo credible and admissible. The motion to exclude it is denied." Mercer's face dropped. His hand trembled slightly as he scribbled something on a legal pad. He no longer seemed interested in reading. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't even look triumphant. But inside, she knew what just happened. She just brought down the walls. Silence wrapped the courtroom like a heavy coat. No one spoke. Not even Judge Hargrove. The stack of damning evidence sat before him, emails, forensic reports, all pointing in the same direction. Karoline Leavitt didn't have to say another word. She had already said enough. Across the aisle, Ethan Mercer stared down at his notes, as though they might rearrange themselves into an escape route. His face, amused then dismissive, was now drained of color. The well-tailored suit, the $1,000 watch, the courtroom charm, none of it mattered anymore. Judge Hargowski cleared his throat. "The court finds sufficient grounds to proceed," he said, his voice quieter than before. "The motion to dismiss is denied." The words landed like a thunderclap. Karoline didn't flinch, didn't move. She just stood there, letting the moment settle, not for herself, but for the people behind her. Mercer rose one last time, but the judge raised a firm hand. "No, Mr. Mercer, this is not your turn." Mercer sat down, slower this time. Karoline turned, slowly toward the back of the courtroom. Her clients were on their feet, not clapping, not cheering, just standing. Some with hands over their mouths, others with eyes glistening. One woman, a retired nurse, victim of one of Horizon's low-risk portfolios, pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "We're finally being heard." Karoline nodded to her. That was the victory. Not a verdict, not a fine, not even a settlement, but acknowledgement, recognition that their voices, so long dismissed, had finally echoed loud enough to matter. Judge Hargrove shifted behind the bench, folding his hands. He looked at Karoline not as an obstacle to procedure, but as someone who had forced the court to see what it had overlooked for years. "Miss Leavitt," he said slowly, "you've presented a compelling body of evidence. The court appreciates your clarity and your restraint." Karoline inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge paused, then quietly, almost to himself, he added, "This court doesn't often get reminded why it exists. Today, it did." And then the smallest gesture. A nod. It wasn't grand, it wasn't theatrical, but it was real, and for Karoline, it was enough. She gathered her files, stacked them neatly, and turned back to the gallery. Her clients waited at the edge of the pews, unsure if they could approach, unsure if this moment was theirs to step into. Karoline stepped down and met them halfway. The nurse who had spoken earlier reached out, trembling slightly. "Do you think they'll settle now?" she asked. Karoline looked her in the eye. "I think they're scared now." A few others smiled. One man, a former veteran wiped out by false asset rebalancing, simply whispered, "Thank you." Karoline didn't say anything in return. She didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, the media waited, reporters crowded behind barricades, cameras already rolling. "Ms. Leavitt, will Horizon face criminal charges? What's your next move? Are you prepared to take this to federal court?" Karoline raised a hand, signaling for silence. Not dismissal, just pause. She looked back at the courthouse doors. Judge Hargrove was still at the bench, quietly reviewing the documents even after the ruling, and then, as though he sensed her gaze, he looked up once more. Their eyes met, and again he nodded. It was the second time, not an apology, but respect. Karoline turned to the cameras. "This case isn't over," she said, "but today we changed something." She stepped down the marble steps, her clients following behind her, not as victims, but as witnesses to something rare, accountability. As they reached the sidewalk, one of them stopped. An older man, worn but proud, looked up at the courthouse and said, "For the first time in a long time, I feel like the system didn't ignore us." Karoline put a hand on his shoulder. "It didn't," she said, "because we didn't let it." And with that she walked into the crowd, not in front of her clients, but beside them. No victory dance, no gloating, just quiet resolve and the promise of a trial to come. Because justice wasn't a destination, it was momentum. And now it was moving. For me, Karoline Leavitt's stand is a blazing testament to what one determined soul can ignite, a spark that turns silence into a roar. It's hard not to feel a surge of hope watching her unravel a system rigged to favor the untouchable, proving justice isn't dead, just dormant until someone dares to wake it. Yet, I wonder, could this be a rare exception in a world where power too often writes the rules? Does her victory truly shift the scales, or is it a fleeting echo drowned by the next wave of corruption? I lean toward optimism, but I'd love to hear your take. Thanks for joining me in this journey. Your thoughts fuel these stories. Drop your perspective below. Agree, disagree? What's your line in the sand? Hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell so we can keep unearthing truths together. Until next time.